sweltering Savannah night, Officer Lena Evans was pinned to a luxury car, forced to watch as steel-toed boots drove into Rex, her German Shepherd K9, until his cries turned thin and raw. The Mafia Heir laughed, certain his family owned the docks, the courts, and the silence between gas lamps. From the darkest edge of the street, Hayes Mitchell, retired Navy SEAL, a man trying to outrun his own war, heard that sound and felt something snap into focus. He didn't rush with sirens or speeches. He measured angles, chose targets, and stepped out of the shadows like judgment you never see coming, because sometimes the only way to save the innocent is to become a ghost. Comment where you're watching from and type amen if you believe light still wins. They held her down and made her watch. Officer Lena Evans couldn't move her arms. She couldn't reach her radio. She couldn't reach Rex. All she could do was breathe through the pressure on her throat and stare at the cobblestones shining under Savannah's gas lamps, while steel-toed boots rose and fell on the body of her German Shepherd K9. Rex yelped again, smaller this time. Not weaker, just forced smaller, like the sound was being squeezed out of him. Lena's eyes burned. "Stop," she tried to say, but it came out as air and panic. A moment earlier, none of this had existed. Earlier that night, Savannah had been what it always pretended to be after midnight. Warm, elegant, sleepy. Spanish moss hung like curtains from live oaks. Jasmine drifted through the humid air. The river carried a faint salty tang that made tourists believe the city was romance and history, nothing more. Lena knew the truth was layered under the charm. She didn't patrol with cynicism, but she didn't patrol naive either. Rex sat in the passenger seat of the K9 cruiser, calm and watchful, even when his ears were relaxed. A sable-backed German shepherd with eyes too intelligent to be fooled by a pretty street. Lena's partner, her anchor. They were rolling past a row of old brick facades when the night tore open with a sound that didn't belong. An engine scream, high and sharp, pushed to its limit. A steel-blue Maserati convertible whipped around the corner, tires skidding on ancient stones. It swerved wildly to avoid a parked carriage, then shot straight into the path of a late-night trolley packed with weary tourists and a guide still trying to sound cheerful. The trolley's brakes hissed and screamed. Passengers shouted. The driver yanked the wheel and shuddered to a stop inches from the sports car. The Maserati didn't pause to apologize. It gunned the engine again and surged away as if near death was entertainment. Lena's decision was instant. "Head up, partner," she said, and flipped on her lights. Red and blue strobed across moss and brick. With one clean maneuver, she boxed the Maserati into a narrow lane and forced it to stop. The car fishtailed, then slammed to a halt. Lena left Rex in the cruiser with the engine running and the AC blasting. She approached on foot, posture steady, hand resting naturally near her holster. The driver climbed out with the swagger of someone who'd never been told no, and meant it. Early 20s. Expensive silk shirt half unbuttoned. Hair arranged to look careless. Bourbon rolling off him in a thick wave. Lena recognized him from quiet warnings and bulletins that didn't linger on names. Nico Petrillo. He blinked at her, then pointed a shaky finger at the Maserati like it was a wounded animal. "Do you have any idea how much this car is worth?" he slurred. "You probably scratched the paint." Lena didn't react. "Sir, I witnessed you nearly cause a major accident with a civilian trolley. License and registration, please." Nico scoffed and pulled out a slim gold phone, fumbling with it like he was offended it required effort. He pressed it to his ear and his voice shifted, arrogance sliding into a childish whine. "Dad? Yeah, it's me. Some K9 cop is bothering me down in the historic district. Handle it." He snapped the phone shut and stared at Lena with glassy certainty. "He'll handle it." Lena kept her voice even. "Step to the sidewalk. I'm conducting a field sobriety test." For a moment, he looked genuinely stunned, as if she had asked him to confess to a crime on camera. Then he stumbled onto the uneven stones, complaining about his shoes, his balance, the street, everything except his own choices. He failed every portion of the test. Lena finished her notes and reached for her cuffs. The metallic click sounded loud in the heavy summer air. "Sir," she said, "based on my observations and your performance, I am placing you under arrest for driving under the influence." Panic flashed across Nico's face, real, raw, and then it vanished as bright headlights washed the scene in white. A mirror-black Escalade glided onto the street, silent and predatory, boxing in the cruiser and the Maserati like a cage closing. The doors opened in near-perfect unison. 4 men stepped out. They weren't street thugs. They were large, dressed in immaculate dark suits, moving with economical purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, as if they'd rehearsed the exact angles of this street. Lena's hand went to her weapon. She didn't draw, yet. "Stay back," she commanded, her police voice ringing clean. "This is an active arrest scene." They didn't slow. The first man lunged, not at her face, not at her chest, at her belt. He grabbed her holster and, with a brutal twist, ripped the entire assembly free. Plastic snapped. Leather tore. Lena's breath hitched in shock more than pain. The second man slammed her radio hand into the Maserati. Her radio clattered to the stones, useless. The third stepped behind her and wrenched her arm back, pinning it in a grip like steel. The largest man wrapped an arm around her throat, not choking her, controlling her completely. Lena fought. She was trained, strong, capable. It didn't matter. This was a professional takedown, and she was outnumbered by men who didn't care about consequences. Nico watched, fear replaced by a slow smile. He sauntered close until Lena could smell bourbon on his breath. He nodded at the man holding her. "Hold her tight, Bruno," he slurred. "I want her to watch." He turned his gaze to the K9 cruiser. Inside, Rex had sensed everything. His bark was deep, frantic, furious. A warning, a promise, a refusal to leave her alone. "You brought your little doggy," Nico said, voice bright with venom. "I hate dogs." Lena's eyes widened. "No, don't you touch my dog. He's a police officer." Her words broke as the grip tightened. 2 suited men moved to the cruiser. They found the K9 release and popped the door. Rex launched out like a coiled spring. 90 pounds of trained devotion aimed at the threat to his handler. They were ready. A steel-toed boot struck his ribs with calculated force. Rex yelped and slammed sideways, claws scraping for traction on stone. Before he could rise, a second kick landed, harder, lower. A wet thud that Lena felt in her own chest. They didn't stop. They kicked him systematically, like they were dismantling something they resented. "Rex!" Lena screamed, fighting uselessly against the arm at her throat. Tears streamed down her face. "Stop! Please!" Nico leaned close, smiling wider as another yelp cut short. "You hear that?" he whispered. "That's you learning your place." Rex's barking turned into strained, broken sound, still defiant, still trying, but forced smaller and smaller by pain. And that was when Hayes Mitchell stopped walking. He had been moving through Savannah like a man trying to outrun himself, cap low, steps quiet, mind busy with old echoes, but the sound of a woman begging and a K9 crying out didn't land in his ears like noise. It landed in his body like a signal. Hayes didn't run toward the lights. He stepped into the darkness at the edge of a brick-lined alley, let the glow of the gas lamps fall behind him, and watched the scene the way he'd watched ambush sites half a world away. Count the threats, find the weak point, choose the first cut. 20 yards, 1 hostage, 1 K9 on the ground, 4 suits, 1 Escalade sealing the street. A lookout leaned near the Escalade's rear quarter, shoulders loose, attention lazy, too confident to scan the shadows. Hayes took 1 slow breath, then moved. He stayed out of the gaslight and used the darkness like cover, sliding behind the Escalade. The lookout leaned on the rear quarter panel, cigarette ember pulsing, attention lazy. He never heard Hayes. A hand cupped his jaw, knuckles struck the temple, and the man folded. Hayes lowered him without a sound and took the sidearm from his waistband, not to start a war, but to end one cleanly. Then he turned to the street. Officer Lena Evans was pinned, her radio smashed, her weapon gone. 2 suited men were still kicking Rex while Nico Petrillo watched close enough to savor it. Hayes didn't announce himself. He removed threats. The first kicker reared back. Hayes caught the wrist and elbow and twisted. The arm went useless. The man screamed and staggered away. The second pivoted fast, but Hayes was already inside his space. A sharp strike emptied his lungs. An elbow snapped his head sideways, and he dropped to his knees, gasping. Nico's smile cracked. "Who?" Bruno, the big one holding Lena, reacted like a professional. He tightened his grip, pulled Lena tight as a shield, and dug for a weapon. "Stay back!" Hayes raised his hands, calm. "Let her go." Bruno's eyes flicked, one heartbeat, toward Nico, waiting for permission. That hesitation was the opening. Hayes stepped forward as if to negotiate, snatched the handcuffs still dangling from Lena's torn belt, pivoted behind Bruno, and yanked the chain across Bruno's throat. The hold broke. Lena stumbled free, dragging in air. Hayes held pressure 3 seconds, only 3, until Bruno went limp and hit the cobblestones. The street went quiet except for Lena's ragged breaths and Rex's thin, pained whimper. Hayes knelt beside Rex first. Pulse, thready there. Rex's chest rose unevenly, every breath a fight. Hayes's hands moved along ribs with unexpected gentleness. "Officer," he said, "are you injured?" Lena swallowed hard. "My dog—" "Nearest K-9 emergency vet," Hayes cut in. Not a question, a task to hold on to. Her radio was gone. Panic surged. "Phone," Hayes said. Her hands shook as she unlocked it on the 3rd try and called the clinic number she knew by heart. "This is Officer Evans," she choked out. "My K-9, Rex, he needs immediate help." Hayes already had Rex in his arms, lifting 90 pounds as if it were nothing but urgency. He laid Rex across the K-9 insert and slid behind the wheel. Lena collapsed into the passenger seat, eyes fixed on Rex's heaving chest. Hayes hit the lights. No siren, empty streets. Controlled speed that felt frightening only because it was so precise. Minutes later, bright clinic lights replaced gas lamps. A technician took one look at the uniform and the limp German shepherd and shouted, "Gurney, K-9 down!" A team swarmed. Hayes laid Rex down with care. Lena followed as if pulled by a rope. Dr. Thorne appeared, tired eyes, steady voice. "We've done x-rays, multiple fractured ribs, one punctured a lung, internal bleeding." Lena's knees softened. "What are his chances?" 50-50, the doctor said. "He needs surgery now." "Yes," Lena whispered. "Do it." The doors swung shut behind Rex. The waiting room was too bright. Plastic chairs, a ticking clock. Lena's hands shook now that adrenaline was gone, guilt rising in waves. Hayes sat across from her like a silent sentry. After a moment, he walked to a battered vending machine and returned with 2 cups of burnt coffee. He held one out. Lena's trembling fingers brushed his. His hand was rock steady. The brief contact anchored her. He sat beside her this time, staring at the blank wall-mounted TV. "He's a K-9, Hayes said quietly. Lena blinked through tears. "What?" "He's not a pet," Hayes continued. "He's a warrior. He's trained to endure. This is his fight. Let him do his job." It wasn't sympathy, it was respect, and it steadied her breathing. Near dawn, Captain Frank Miller called Lena into his office. "Rex is out of surgery," he said. "Stable. Next 12 hours are critical." Relief hit Lena so hard her eyes stung. She nodded, unable to speak. Miller's face tightened when he reached the name in her report. "Evans, Nico Petrillo was bailed out 3 hours ago." Lena's head snapped up. "How?" "Lawyer at booking before your backup arrived," Miller said flatly. "This family owns half the docks and enough people downtown to bend reality." He leaned forward. "Administrative leave, 72 hours, standard procedure." "It feels like isolation," Lena said. Miller didn't argue. "Watch your back." Lena walked out into harsh morning sun, suddenly aware of how empty her belt felt without a badge and a sidearm. Her car waited at the far edge of the lot. A man stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, as if he'd been there all along. Impeccable suit, practiced smile, slim briefcase. "Officer Evans," he said smoothly. "Julian K., counsel for the Petrillo family. We'd like to make a substantial donation to your K-9 unit, in exchange for a small clarification in your report." Lena's blood ran cold. Kay stepped closer, voice dropping into something that sounded polite and felt like a blade. "And for your safety," he added, smile intact, "I do hope you have good brakes. Savannah streets get very slippery when it rains." Julian Kay's smile never reached his eyes. "I do hope you have good brakes," he said softly. "Savannah streets get very slippery when it rains." Then he was gone, his black Mercedes gliding out of the police lot. leaving Officer Lena Evans in the heat with an empty belt and a hard, cold thought. That hadn't been advice. It had been a promise. On the drive home, she checked her mirrors until her neck ached. Every car behind her felt too patient. Every turn felt watched. She told herself she was exhausted, that fear was inventing shadows. But Kay's words kept looping, slippery when it rains. Her apartment sat on the ground floor. One deadbolt, two sliding windows, a front door that suddenly looked like paper. Inside, she double-locked the knob, slid the chain, and stood still, listening. Footsteps upstairs, a distant television, a car door somewhere down the block. Ordinary sounds, now sharpened into warnings. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. How's the warrior? Lena stared, breath caught. Nobody called Rex that except the man who had lifted him like a fallen teammate. Stable, out of surgery, still critical, she typed. The reply came instantly. I'm aware of the threat. Your apartment is a tactical vulnerability. I'm on my way. She swallowed. Tactical vulnerability, cold, accurate. You don't have to. I'm fine. No, you're not. 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, there was a knock. Firm, controlled. Lena checked the peephole. Hayes Mitchell stood there in a dark t-shirt and jeans, a canvas tool bag on one shoulder, and a sealed hardware package in his hand. His eyes flicked to the hinges, the frame, the window beside the door, like he was measuring failure points. She opened the door a crack. What is that? Grade 1 deadbolt, Hayes said, stepping in. What you have now is a suggestion. He set the tool bag down and looked around once, quick and thorough. Ground floor, single pane, door jambs soft. It's an apartment, Lena said, defensive before she could stop herself. It's a target, he replied, not unkind. Where are your tools? In the kitchen closet. Hayes worked without ceremony. Drill, screws, steel plate into the jamb, secondary locks onto the windows. He tested each point twice. Push, pull, listen, then moved on. Lena sat at the table and watched, unsure whether she was more grateful or ashamed that it took a stranger to make her feel safe in her own home. When he finished, he finally spoke again. This doesn't stop them. It buys time. Thank you, Lena said quietly. Hayes's gaze dropped to her hands, red and raw from scrubbing dried blood away. They isolated you, he said. Lena exhaled. They took my badge and gun for the leave. Rex is in ICU. My family's in Oregon. The words came out thin. It's just been me and him since the academy. She rubbed a faint scar on her knuckle. He gave me this when he was 12 weeks old, bit me the day I chose him. Hayes glanced down at the long, pale line on his forearm, a scar that didn't belong to any normal life. For a moment, he looked far away. Kandahar, he said. Shrapnel, bad call. His jaw tightened once. Friend didn't make it. The room settled into a quiet that wasn't awkward, just heavy with shared understanding. Then Lena's phone rang. Savannah Emergency Vet Clinic. She froze. I can't, she whispered. I can't answer. Yes, you can, Hayes said, and put it on speaker. This is Dr. Thorne. Is Officer Evans there? I'm here, Lena managed, hands pressed to her mouth. A pause, one beat too long. Then the doctor's voice softened. Your partner is a medical miracle. He's stubborn. His vitals have been rock solid for hours. He's pulling through. Lena's knees went weak. He's going to make it? He is, Dr. Thorne confirmed. He has a long recovery, but he's going to make it. A relief hit like a wave. Lena's phone slipped onto the counter, and she stepped forward without thinking, wrapping her arms around Hayes. Hayes froze for a heartbeat. Then, carefully, as if remembering a language he rarely used, his arms came up and held her steady. He didn't offer promises. He simply stayed solid while she shook and cried. When she pulled back, Hayes only said, Good. 48 hours later, the relief had thinned into restlessness. Administrative leave was supposed to protect her. For Lena, it felt like containment. She paced the apartment, stared out the blinds, called the clinic twice. Rex was improving, angry, sore, fighting. Dr. Thorne said that was the best sign. On the third morning, Captain Frank Miller called her in. The squad room felt different in civilian clothes. Conversations dipped, eyes slid away. Nobody said traitor, but the silence said problem. Miller looked like he hadn't slept. I'm going to be straight with you, he said. Internal Affairs is opening an investigation. Lena's stomach dropped. Into Nico? Into what they did to Rex? Miller's jaw tightened. No, into your escalation, and into the excessive force used by your unidentified accomplice. My accomplice, Lena repeated, stunned. He saved me. They're flipping it, Miller said. Kay filed the complaint. The department wants this to go away. And you're, going to bury it? Miller's eyes flashed with anger and shame. I'm ordering you to desk duty. Archives, basement, no street, no active files, and you will not contact your witness. It wasn't discipline. It was burial by policy. That night, Hayes sat in the driver's seat of a nondescript gray sedan across from Lena's building, engine off. Windows cracked. He watched her lights go on, then off. He watched the street for the kind of quiet that meant something was coming. At 2:40 a.m., a dark blue commercial van rolled in and parked half on the curb. Faded lettering, Acme Plumbing. The plates were smeared with fresh mud. Two men stepped out in hoodies, crowbars in hand, and walked straight toward Lena's door. Hayes opened his car door without a sound and stepped into the shadow of the live oak as the first crowbar rose toward the lock. Hayes moved like smoke. He didn't rush the men head on. He closed distance through the shadow under the live oak, using the wooden stairwell alcove as a blind spot. The intruders were focused on the door. They expected fear. They expected a scream. They expected a soft target behind a thin lock. They never expected a ghost. Hayes struck the weapon first, a hard palm to the wrist, sharp, exact, and the crowbar clattered onto concrete. Before the man could inhale, Hayes drove a precise blow to the throat. Not a punch meant to win a bar fight. An impact meant to silence. The man collapsed, gagging, hands clawing at his neck. The second intruder roared and swung his own crowbar in a wide arc. Hayes was already under it. He stepped inside the man's reach, grabbed wrist and elbow, and used the attacker's momentum to slam him face first into the brick wall of the stairwell. A hollow thud. The man slid down in a heap. No gunshots, no yelling. Two threats ended in seconds. Across the street, Hayes dragged both unconscious bodies to the van, shoved them into the back, and took the keys. He wiped the crowbar handles clean with a rag from the tool bag and tossed them back inside like returning someone's property. Then he went back to his sedan and waited. Inside the apartment, Lena had heard the crowbar clatter. Her heart had jumped into her throat. She crept to the door, fingers tight around the new deadbolt Hayes had installed. Through the peephole, she saw nothing. Only the gas lamp's weak pool of light and empty shadows. For a moment, she wondered if she was losing her mind. She backed away, shaking, and sat on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest until dawn softened the edges of the night. In the morning, Dr. Thorne's update came like oxygen. Rex is improving, he said. Angry, sore, trying to stand. That's good. Lena pressed a hand over her eyes and let the relief steady her for 3 seconds, then remembered she was still trapped in a different fight. At the precinct, the basement archive smelled like dust and old paper. A gray metal desk, a wheezing photocopier, no windows, no radio chatter. It wasn't work, it was burial. 2 days passed like that. Cold cases, faded photos, names that never got justice. Lena's anger curdled into something heavier, resignation. That evening, as she walked through the secure police lot toward her car, a shadow separated from a concrete pillar. Hayes. Lena's hand flew to her hip out of instinct and found only denim. Her pulse spiked. You can't be here, she hissed, glancing around. They're investigating you. They're calling you my accomplice. I am, Hayes said, voice low. Not pride, fact. His eyes scanned the roofline and the far fence like he expected movement. This is what they do. They isolate you, discredit you, make you invisible, then they remove you. Lena swallowed. So what? They won. I'm in the basement. Rex is recovering. Nico's probably drinking on a yacht. Hayes stepped closer, not invading, anchoring. You're wrong, he said, tone sharpening. You still have something they want. Lena frowned. What? Your silence, Hayes said, and you're going to sell it to them. The plan felt reckless the moment he said it, and that was how Lena knew it was probably the only plan that worked. You're going to call Julian Kay, Hayes said, not as a cop, as someone broken who wants her life back. You're going to accept the donation and ask for a private meeting. And then, Lena asked, heart hammering. A recorder, Hayes said. He pulled a slim device from his pocket, smaller than a credit card. My wire, not the department's. You get Kay and Nico talking. You get them to admit the bribe, the threats, and why. The truth has to come out of their mouths. Lena's throat tightened. That's illegal? Hayes didn't flinch. So is what they did to Rex. The logic was cold. The purpose was clear. An hour later, Lena sat on her living room floor. Hayes stood by the window, watching the street like it was a hostile perimeter. Lena dialed the number on Kay's card. Her hands shook, but Hayes's plan needed fear. It needed her voice to sound real. Kay answered on the second ring. Mr. Kay, Lena began, letting her breath hitch. It's Officer Evans. I can't do this anymore. Silence, then a smile you could hear. Officer, how pleasant. Have you had time to reconsider our offer of clarification? They put me in the archives, Lena whispered, letting her voice break. They're going to ruin me. I just want it to stop. The money, the donation. I'll do it. I'll clarify. Kay's voice softened into syrup. I'm so glad you've seen reason, Lena. These matters are best handled quietly, a private conversation. They set the meeting for midnight. Location, an old shipping warehouse along the river, property tied to the Petrillo docks. When Lena hung up, her stomach rolled. Hayes crouched behind her and taped the recorder to the small of her back, flat against her skin so it wouldn't print through her shirt. He handed her a flesh-colored earpiece. One way, he said. I can hear you. You can't hear me unless I override it. He demonstrated 3 sharp clicks. Static pulsed in her ear. If you hear that, he said, you walk out, no hesitation. Then he placed a small pistol in her palm. Compact, heavy, real. Lena stared at it. Where did you get this? Don't ask, Hayes said. You're not going in to be a hero. You're an actress. Get the recording and get out. Midnight came with a colder wind off the river. The warehouse loomed like a rusted skeleton. Lena parked where they instructed, headlights carving a narrow cone into the darkness. She stepped out, heart thudding, and walked toward the open bay door. Inside, the space was cavernous, lit by a few dangling bulbs. Julian Kay stood in the center, suit too perfect for the grime. His arms open like a priest welcoming confession. Lena, my dear, he said warmly, I'm so glad you came. Then Lena saw the second figure. Nico Petrillo stepped forward, sober-eyed and smiling like a knife. And behind him, 6 men in black cargo pants and plate carriers, rifles held with quiet competence. Their beams were off, but their posture screamed training. Not dock workers, not suits, operators. Lena's blood turned to ice. From a perch half a mile away on an old crane, Hayes watched through optics. He saw the rifles. He saw the angles. He saw the glint, tiny, almost invisible, of a scope across the river. Counter-overwatch. Old Hayes clicked the transmitter. 3 sharp bursts of static screamed in Lena's ear. Abort! 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 Lena flinched, forcing a shaky smile. I forgot my bag in the car. A mercenary moved, blocking the door. Nico's smile widened. You're not going anywhere. And in the same breath, the bulbs above them exploded, glass raining down as the entire warehouse plunged into suffocating darkness, cutting the world in half. The warehouse went dark like a curtain dropped. For one stunned heartbeat, there was only the sound of falling glass and Nico Petrillo's sharp inhale. Then panic tried to fill the space. Boots scraping, a muffled curse, the click of a safety being thumbed off. Lights, a mercenary barked. Weapon lights, now. 6 beams snapped on at once, hard white knives cutting through the darkness. The men swept them across pillars and rafters, searching for what they couldn't name. Their training kept them moving in pairs, rifles shouldered, voices clipped. But in a place like this, light was not safety. Light was a confession. From his perch outside, Hayes listened to the first seconds of chaos like he listened to weather. Calm, exact. The transformer shot had been deliberate, not anger. Darkness was the one advantage he could create that money couldn't buy. He didn't speak into the channel yet. He waited for the second threat to show itself. Across the river, the counter-sniper adjusted. Night vision came up. He searched for the muzzle flash that never repeated. He had expected a hero to freeze after one shot. He had expected a pattern. Hayes didn't give patterns. He shifted along the crane's gantry, 20 yards to a new angle, breath slow. His rifle spoke once, heavy, muted, and the far rooftop went still. No scream, no drama, just one scope that would never find its target again. Only then did Hayes press the transmitter. "Overwatch is blind," he murmured into Lena's earpiece, voice low and controlled. "Stay in shadow. Do not run into open space." Lena pressed her back to a rusted iron pillar, cold metal biting through her shirt. She could hear mercenaries close enough to smell oil and sweat. Their lights swept inches from her face, then slid away. She forced her breathing down, counting silently the way she had in training, 4 in, 4 out, because panic made noise. Nico's voice cracked through the dark. "Where is he?" he shouted, firing his pistol blindly. The shots were thunder in the enclosed space, sparks skipping off steel. Julian K. whimpered somewhere behind a stack of pallets. "Nico, please!" "Shut up!" Nico snapped. A mercenary grabbed Nico's shoulder. "Back office," he said. "We move." Hayes heard it all, mapped it in his head, and chose not to chase. Chase made people predictable. Instead, he made the building itself fight for him. A mercenary pair took cover behind rotted pallets 30 feet from Lena's pillar. They kept their rifles trained on the open bay door, expecting an entry that never came. Hayes didn't shoot them. He shot the corroded steel girder above them. The round hit metal with a sharp crack. Rust dust burst like smoke. A heavy segment of ironwork broke free and slammed down onto the pallets, collapsing their cover with a violent crash. 2 men cried out, short, stunned, and their weapon lights swung wildly, then fell still. They weren't dead. They were out. "Stay down," Hayes whispered into Lena's ear. "Let them crawl." At the bay door, 2 mercenaries tried to retreat to the outside. Hayes saw their lights cluster and angled his neck shots at the ground in front of their boots. Concrete erupted, spall and stone fragments slicing into shins. Both men dropped with screams, hands clawing at legs that refused to hold them. Still alive, still neutralized. The darkness kept chewing through their confidence. Inside the warehouse, the remaining mercenary moved with Nico and Kay toward the small office block at the rear. Thin walls, one doorway, a place where their lights could control lanes. Lena heard the boots moving away and knew instinctively that if they got Nico behind a door, the night would get harder. Hayes' voice came again, quiet but sharp. "Lena, move 10 yards forward, low, use the pillars." Lena went. She didn't sprint, she slid. One pillar to the next, shoulder brushing rust, knees scraping grit. A weapon light snapped toward her movement, and a burst of automatic fire chewed the pillar she'd just left. Metal shrieked, dust filled her mouth. She didn't stop breathing. She rolled into shadow behind the next column, heart hammering but mind narrowing. Hayes had given her the only thing she had lacked on the street. A plan. A mercenary stepped into the lane, rifle up, light glaring. Lena saw him before he saw her. He was blinded by his own beam, hunting ghosts in open space. She didn't raise the pistol. She used her training. Lena drove her shoulder into his midsection, slammed him into a corrugated wall, and struck his throat with a rigid, controlled blow. The rifle clattered. The mercenary folded, gagging, hands to his neck, air stolen, neutralized. Now there was only Nico. His pistol trembled in his hand. He fired once into the dark, wild, pointless. "Show yourself!" he screamed, voice cracking. "You think you're a hero?" Lena stepped out of shadow, steadying her stance the way she'd practiced 1,000 times at the range. She pressed the compact pistol to his temple, not because she wanted to shoot, but because she needed him to understand he had no power left. Nico froze. "Don't, please," he blurted, suddenly small. Lena's voice shook, but it held. "Nico Petrillo, you are under arrest." She struck him once, open palm, enough to break his balance, not his bones. She twisted his wrist behind his back and snapped handcuffs on him with the clean, familiar click that had started all of this. In the dark, that click sounded like a verdict. Somewhere, Julian K. made a strangled noise, trying to crawl backward. Lena kept her focus on Nico. The recorder on her back felt like a hot secret. She prayed it had captured enough. Kay's offer. Nico's words. The trap. In her ear, Hayes spoke for the last time. "It's done. Get away from windows." "What?" Lena started. "The cavalry is coming," Hayes said, "and I'm a ghost." The feed went dead with a final soft click. 5 minutes later, sirens rose in the distance. 10 minutes later, red and blue lights flooded the warehouse through the open bay, turning darkness into a strobing nightmare. Captain Frank Miller was the first through the doorway, gun drawn, eyes wide. He swept the scene and stopped as if he couldn't make his mind accept it. Lena stood dirty and shaking but upright. Nico Petrillo was cuffed to a support beam. Around them, mercenaries groaned, alive, injured, disarmed. Miller stared at Lena as if she had rearranged reality. "Evans," he said, voice low with disbelief. "What did you do?" Lena swallowed, feeling the weight of the recorder against her spine. "I was on desk duty, sir," she said hoarsely, "reviewing a cold case." And outside, somewhere beyond the river's breath and the gas lamps, Hayes Mitchell was already walking away, back into the dark before anyone could put his name in a report. Red and blue lights flooded the warehouse in hard pulses, turning the darkness into a strobing confession. Captain Frank Miller pushed through the bay door with his weapon drawn, took one look at Nico Petrillo cuffed to a support beam, and stopped like his brain refused to accept the picture. Mercenaries groaned on the concrete, alive but broken. Rifles scattered and useless. Julian Kay stood off to the side, suit dusty, face tight with controlled outrage. Lena stood near Nico, breathing hard, hands still shaking from the adrenaline drop. The small device taped to her lower back felt heavier than a badge. Miller lowered his weapon slowly. "Evans," he said, voice rough, "are you hurt?" Lena swallowed. "No, sir." Miller's gaze cut to Nico. "And him?" "Alive," Lena said. "Cuffed." Kay stepped forward immediately, voice smooth as polished stone. He tried to turn the scene into language, because language was where he won. He insisted this was an illegal ambush. He suggested Lena had lured his client here. He called Hayes an unidentified violent accomplice. He demanded Nico be released for his safety. Miller didn't answer him. Instead, he did what good cops did when the story was trying to get rewritten in real time. He locked down facts. He ordered medics. He ordered photos. He ordered every weapon bagged. He ordered everyone kept separated. No conversations, no coordinating lies. When a patrol officer approached Lena with a blanket, Miller leaned in and saw the edge of the recorder tape line at her waist. "What's that?" he asked quietly. Lena hesitated, just long enough to understand how dangerous honesty had become, then turned her back slightly so he could see. "Evidence," she said, voice hoarse. Miller's jaw tightened, not anger at her, anger at the world that had forced this. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't ask how legal it was. He made a decision. "Bag it," he ordered a trusted detective, low and direct. "Chain of custody, now." Kay heard the words, and his expression snapped sharper. "Captain, that device is unauthorized surveillance." Miller cut him off without raising his voice. "Counsel, you can make your arguments in court, not here, not tonight." Nico tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "You don't get it," he muttered, eyes bright with spite. "My father—" Miller crouched slightly so Nico had to look at him. "You're done talking," he said. "You talk to your lawyer." For the first time since the traffic stop, the heir's confidence wavered. Then the pressure arrived, right on schedule. Miller's phone vibrated. He answered, listened, and his face changed in small, controlled increments. Disbelief, then fury, then the kind of restraint that hurt. When he hung up, he looked at Lena like he was choosing his next words carefully. "Downtown wants this contained," he said. "They're calling it entrapment. They're calling you reckless. They're calling the men with rifles private security." Lena felt heat rise behind her eyes. "They tried to execute my K9. "I know," Miller said, voice low. "And I'm done pretending I don't know." He turned away from her, stepped aside, and made a call of his own, short, clipped, to someone higher than their local chain. When he returned, he didn't look relieved. He looked committed. "State investigators are coming," he said, "and once they touch this, it stops being a Savannah cleanup." Kay's gaze flickered, one crack in the armor. He pulled out his phone and typed fast, like a man trying to get ahead of a wave he could finally see. By sunrise, Savannah tried to pretend nothing had happened. News trucks hovered at the edge of the precinct. Anonymous sources whispered the same poisoned narrative. A rogue officer. An unidentified assailant. A botched sting. The city's usual charm returned in daylight, as if cobblestones couldn't hold blood memory. But the warehouse had created a problem too big to bury neatly. A team arrived, quiet, efficient, not impressed by local influence. They photographed the rifles. They tracked serial numbers. They asked hard questions about why armored men with long guns were inside a riverfront warehouse at midnight. They took statements that couldn't be unspoken, and they took Julian Kay's smile away, piece by piece. Lena sat through her interview with hands folded, so no one would see the tremor. She told the truth in a straight line. Traffic stop, assault, K9 beaten, threats, the donation offer, the warehouse trap. She left Hayes out as much as she could, because the ghost had done exactly what he promised. He had saved her, then disappeared. Afterward, Miller caught her in the hallway. "They're going to come at you," he warned. "Not with fists, with paperwork." Lena nodded. "I've seen the basement." Miller hesitated, then handed her back something she thought she wouldn't touch again so soon. Her K9 unit keyring. "Go see your partner," he said. "You've earned that much?" At the emergency clinic, the bright antiseptic smell hit her like a memory. Tanya at the desk looked exhausted, eyes rimmed red from too many hours. "He's awake," Tanya whispered, like it was sacred. "He's angry." Lena's throat tightened. "That's my boy." Dr. Thorne met her in the hall, voice careful. "He's stable," he said, "but he can't take stress. No loud voices, no strangers." Lena nodded and reached for the door handle, then paused, catching something in the doctor's expression. "What is it?" she asked. Dr. Thorne sighed. "This morning I got a call, a lawyer. He said your dog is dangerous evidence. He asked about euthanasia protocols and legal transfer." Lena's skin went cold. "Who?" Thorne didn't need to say it. In Savannah, power wore a name. "They can't," Lena said, voice shaking with controlled rage. "Rex is an officer." "They can try," Thorne replied gently. "That's why I wanted you to know. We tightened access, staff only, and if anyone shows paperwork, we call you and the captain immediately." Elena stepped into Rex's room. He lay on padded bedding, ribs wrapped, IV line taped carefully. His eyes were open, tired, pained, but present. When he saw her, his ears shifted and his tail gave a slow, stubborn thump. Lena crouched and pressed her forehead to his. "Hey, warrior," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." Rex's breath rasped, but he leaned into her touch, as if he understood the fight had changed shape. Across town, in an office that smelled like old money and river wind, Don Petrillo listened to Julian Kay's report without raising his voice. The calm was worse than shouting. "Again?" Don said quietly. "Yes," Kay admitted. "They have weapons, witnesses, and potentially a recording." Don's fingers tapped once on his desk, one measured beat. "Then we remove what they love," he said. "You said the dog survived." Kay swallowed. "Yes." Don's eyes remained flat. "Make that less certain." Lena's phone rang as she was leaving the clinic. Tanya's voice came fast, thin with fear. "Officer Evans, someone's here. 2 men. They say they have paperwork to take Rex, and..." She lowered her voice to a whisper. The lights in the hallway just went out. Lena stopped moving. In the background, through the phone, she heard a single sound, low, deep, protective, Rex growling, and then the line crackled like someone's hand had found the power switch. Lena didn't waste a second asking questions she already knew the answers to. She grabbed her keys and ran, barefoot for 3 steps before she stopped, forced herself back into control, and shoved her feet into shoes with shaking hands. As she drove, she called Captain Frank Miller. "Clinic," she said, breath tight. "They're here for Rex. Tanya said the hall lights went out." Miller didn't ask for details. "Stay on the line," he ordered. "I'm rolling units now." Savannah's streets blurred under the headlights. Lena kept hearing Julian Kay's voice in her mind, slippery when it rains, because this wasn't about weather. It was about control. Take the dog, erase the symbol, break the officer. When she hit the parking lot, the clinic looked wrong. The front sign was lit, but the side corridor windows were dark, as if someone had cut the building in half. She pushed through the glass doors. Tanya was at the front desk, white-faced, hands hovering over the phone like she was afraid to touch it. Behind her, two men stood too still for animal control. Polos, clipboards, calm smiles that didn't belong in an emergency clinic at night. Dr. Thorne stepped out from the hallway, blocking the line of sight toward Rex's room. "Officer Evans," he said quickly. "They claim they have paperwork." One of the men lifted a folder with a seal Lena didn't recognize. "Court-ordered transfer," he said pleasantly. "The animal is classified as dangerous evidence and a liability. We're here to secure it." Oh, Lena heard the phrase and felt her stomach harden. Dangerous evidence, liability. That was Kay's language, dressed up in official ink. She stepped closer, eyes on the seal, the case number, the signature line. Her voice stayed even. "Hand it to me." The man's smile tightened. "Ma'am, this is sensitive." "Hand it to me," Lena repeated sharper. He hesitated, just long enough for Lena to catch the first flaw. The county header was wrong. Wrong formatting. Wrong department name. A fake made by someone who assumed nobody here would challenge paper. Lena didn't announce it. She used it. "I'm on the phone with Captain Miller," she said, holding the folder just high enough for them to see she had it. "You can explain this to him." The second man shifted his weight, a subtle step toward the hallway. Tanya flinched. Dr. Thorne held his ground, but Lena saw the calculation behind the man's eyes. If he could reach Rex first, the paperwork didn't matter. Lena moved one step to block him. "No one goes back there," she said. The first man's voice cooled. "Officer, you're on desk duty. You don't have jurisdiction over this clinic." Lena kept her gaze steady. "That's funny," she said quietly. "Because you don't have jurisdiction over anything. This order is fake." The words hit like a switch. The polite mask slipped. The second man lunged toward the hallway. Before Lena could move, Rex's growl rolled out of the darkness. Deep, protective, unmistakable. Even injured, even drugged with pain meds, Rex knew what the men were. The second man froze for a fraction of a second. Just enough. "Stop!" Miller's voice snapped from Lena's phone, now loud on speaker. "Both of you, hands where we can see them. Units are 30 seconds out." The first man reached for Tanya's desk phone like he meant to rip the line out of the wall. And that was when a shadow moved at the clinic's side entrance, so quick Tanya didn't even see it at first. A third figure stepped into the edge of the lobby light, hand on the breaker panel door that had been forced open. He looked startled, like he hadn't expected anyone to be there. Hayes Mitchell didn't speak. He crossed the distance in 2 silent steps, caught the man's wrist as it reached for the switch, and pinned him to the wall with controlled pressure. Not a beating. A lock. A decision. The man's knees buckled. Hayes guided him down, took the tool that had been used on the panel, and slid it into his own pocket as calmly as if he were returning a misplaced item. Then he looked up, eyes meeting Lena's for one brief second. Ghost. The 2 men in polos saw him and made the wrong choice. They ran for the door. Miller's units hit the entrance as they did. 2 patrol officers moving fast, weapons drawn, voices loud enough to fill the room with authority. The men stopped, hands up, faces suddenly full of innocence that arrived too late. "On the ground," an officer barked. The cuffs clicked shut. Lena's knees softened, the delayed shock finally catching up. She leaned against the counter, breathing hard. Tanya let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Dr. Thorne exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding air since the lights went out. "Rex?" Lena asked. "Still in his room," Thorne said. "Still breathing." Lena walked down the corridor, past the dark panel, past the emergency lights, until she reached the door. Rex lay on his bedding, ribs wrapped, eyes open. When he saw her, his tail gave a slow, stubborn thump. He didn't rise. He didn't need to. Lena crouched, forehead to his. "Hey, warrior," she whispered. "They tried. They didn't get you." Rex huffed, painful, determined, and leaned into her like a promise. Outside, the night began to unravel into sirens and paperwork and consequences. The fake order turned into charges, impersonation, attempted theft, obstruction, tampering with evidence. The warehouse rifles turned into bigger questions that didn't belong to Savannah anymore. serial numbers traced, shipping logs reviewed, warrants signed. And when the recorder's audio was played in a room with people who didn't owe Don Petrillo favors, Julian Kay's polished voice became what it always was: proof. 2 days later, Don Petrillo was taken at the docks in front of his own men, calm face finally cracked by the sight of federal jackets and sealed warrants. Nico's lawyer couldn't laugh his way out of that. For Lena, the victory didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like breathing. A week later, under clean daylight at Forsyth Park, Rex trotted carefully in a medical harness, still sore but alive, ears up, eyes bright. Lena threw a blue ball and Rex caught it midair, landing with a proud, controlled bounce that made Tanya, there with a coffee in her hands, wipe her eyes and pretend it was the sun. A shadow fell beside Lena. Hayes stood there with a duffel bag over his shoulder, plain clothes, quiet eyes. "He looks good," Hayes said. "He's a warrior," Lena answered. They watched Rex for a moment in silence. "I'm leaving," Hayes said finally. Lena nodded. She didn't ask where. She already knew the kind of life he lived didn't allow clean explanations. "Thank you," she said anyway. Hayes shook his head once. "Don't thank me. Keep your people close. Keep your locks secure. And keep him fighting." Rex jogged back, dropped the ball at Lena's feet, then looked up at Hayes, head tilted slightly, as if recognizing the shape of a guardian. Hayes gave Rex a single nod. Then he turned and walked away into the crowd, disappearing the way he always had, quietly, without asking to be remembered. Lena picked up the ball again, smiled through a tight throat, and threw it once more. Rex ran, not away from fear this time, but toward the simple, stubborn joy of still being here.